David Wall.
I'm Cleve Corner on the. You good? I'm the manager of author and speaker engagement at the Pratt. Thank you so much for coming out. Some very brief housekeeping before we start. Tonight, David will speak for about a half hour to 40 minutes, and then we'll take your questions. We have microphones on this side, and we're going to have a microphone on that side in a moment. If you could bring your questions to the microphones, we'd appreciate it. We have a virtual audience that's joining us. That way they'll hear the question. Following the event, David will be signing books out in our hallway. We have Charm City Books, our on-site book selling partner here. Please, if you have the opportunity, buy a copy of the book. I have to say this because I'm very proud of it, but we now have free parking here at the Pratt for our author programs. If you park at the Franklin Street Garage for any of our programs after 4 o'clock, myself or my colleagues will give you a parking voucher. This way, you don't have to worry about parking here anymore. When I took this job, everyone said, parking's an issue. Parking is no longer an excuse. Yes, okay. And without further ado, David Maraniss is Associate Editor of the Washington Post and a two-time recipient of the Pulitzer Prize in Journalism. He is the author of best-selling biographies of Vince Lombardi, Roberto Clemente, Barack Obama, and Bill Clinton. Tonight, he joins us to discuss his latest book, Path Lit by Lightning, The Life of Jim Thorpe. In it, he examines the life of arguably the greatest athlete of modern times. Thorpe was a gold medal Olympian in the decathlon and pentathlon, a member of the first class of Pro Football Hall of Fame, and a professional baseball player. He was also a member of the Sac and Fox Nation who faced discrimination throughout his life. In her review of the book, biographer Jane Levy said, David Maraniss brilliantly rescues Jim Thorpe from myth and prejudice, restoring something more consequential than the Olympic medals stolen from him by small men, his humanity. This is another masterpiece from the master of biography. And sports writer and author Howard Bryant called Path Lit by Lightning a masterful look at this country's first super athlete, unflinching from what conquest did to his people, from the rousing and bittersweet journey of fame and identity, nor from an American century often far less heroic than the book's protagonist. It's simply brilliant. Without further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce David Maraniss.
Thanks, Cleve, and thank you all for coming out on this cold and rainy night. It seems like a night that Edgar Allan Poe would like. In the spring of 1911, a young business teacher at the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania would go out and watch the athletes practicing on the field. And she wrote of one of them, he had a kind of ease in his gait that's hard to describe, equilibrium with no stricture, but couched in football, he was the epitome of concentration, wary, with an effect of plenty and reserve. That young business teacher was Marianne Moore, the great American poet, who was teaching at Carlisle in that era, and she was writing about Jim Thorpe. Jim Thorpe was an unparalleled athlete. What he did, no one has done before or since. He was not only an Olympian gold medalist in the decathlon and pentathlon, but also an All-American football player at Carlisle and a Major League Baseball player. There have been a lot of great athletes in American history, and none have done that trifecta except Jim Thorpe. He was also said to be a great ballroom dancer and was even good at marbles. But that's not why I wrote this book. I consider this book the third in a trilogy of sports biographies that I've written. Vince Lombardi, Roberto Clemente, and Jim Thorpe. And in each case, I'm looking for two things. One is just an incredible story of athletic performance, but beyond that, a way to use that athletic achievement to illuminate American history and sociology. So with Vince Lombardi, it was not just about this great football coach, but also a means for me to explore the mythology of competition and success in American life, what it takes and what it costs. For Roberto Clemente, it was not just about this beautiful ball player, but also a way to look at the Latino experience in the mainland. And also, So many athletes are called heroes, but very few really are. And Roberto Clemente was as close as you can come. He lived up to his motto, if you have a chance to help others and fail to do so, you're wasting your time on this earth. He died living out that motto, trying to deliver humanitarian aid to Nicaragua after an earthquake. He died in a plane crash. And then Jim Thorpe, not only that brilliant athlete, but also for me a way to explore the Native American experience through his life. One of the many angles that I use to look at in this book. His life really tracked so cleanly the way that the US government and white society dealt with Native Americans, indigenous peoples, from the time he was born in 1887 until he died in 1953. Bracketed by these two really important seminal events. 1887, the year he was born, was the year that the Congress enacted what was the Dawes Act, which was another means of taking away indigenous lands and giving them back giving them to white people. In this case, it was by saying that you're taking away communal lands and saying now you'll have private property. But it would take 25 years for the natives who lost their land to prove that they deserved that property. Many of them lost it again. And that's what created the Oklahoma land runs, celebrated by Oklahomans as this great achievement. In fact, it was Boomer Sooner represented land thieves, the Sooners who came too soon, and the Boomers who abetted them, taking away Native American lands for what became Oklahoma. And he died in 1953, the year that Congress passed another hideous act, the Detribalization Act, which was an effort to take away the sovereignty of all indigenous peoples. Luckily, that one didn't last too long, but that was passed the year Jim Thorpe died. At the center of this book is another aspect of how the government treated Native Americans, and that are the Indian boarding schools. Jim Thorpe attended 3 boarding schools in his life. The first was the Sack and Fox boarding school in Stroud, Oklahoma, where he and his twin brother, Charlie, went when they were 7, 8, and 9 years old. And Charlie actually died there of a disease that swept through the boarding school, which was very common in that era. Then Thorpe was sent to the Haskell Institute in Lawrence, Kansas, from age 11 to 13, where he kept trying to run away. And finally, his father and his stepmother, his father was kind of a ruffian who had 5 wives and 18 children. At age 16, they didn't want Thorpe around, so they sent him as far away as they could to the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania. That school was founded in 1879, only 3 years after the Battle of the Little Bighorn. And the first students there were mostly Lakota Sioux, the young sons and daughters of the warriors who'd fought against Custer and in many of the Indian wars in the West. And the whole concept of that school was articulated by the founder, Richard Henry Pratt. No relation to this Pratt. Richard Henry Pratt was quite a different character. But anyway, his motto was, kill the Indian, save the man. That was the foundation of the school, which meant take away their religion, their language, their culture, shear their braids and dress them in the uniforms of the United States Cavalry, in every matter of forced acculturation in every possible way. When Thorpe got there in 1904, Pratt was still around, but on his way out. And Jim Thorpe, for the first 3 years of his life at that school, wasn't even there. One of the sort of scams of that school, in a sense, was called the outing system, where the young Indian students were sent out to the farms in Pennsylvania, Maryland, New Jersey, and Delaware to serve basically as indentured servants for the farmers of that area. Some of them treated the young students well, and many didn't. And there are a lot of cases, again, of students running away from those farms. But the scam was that the young students were getting paid a minimum amount for going to these farms. That money was going back to the school, which was also receiving money from the federal government for each student they had. So Thorpe, like many of the students, was not really at the school for a large periods of time. Finally, in 1907, after he'd been there for 3 years, and by the way, when he arrived at Carlisle from the Haskell Institute, he was 16 years old, stood 5'5" and weighed 115 pounds. Kind of incredible when you think about the figure that he became. But 3 years later, in 1907, he was working at the school on the farm, the gardens that the school had, and he walked by the track and saw some members of the track team trying to clear the high jump bar at about 6 feet, and none of them were doing it. Thorpe was in his overalls. This story sounds mythological, but it's based in truth. Thorpe was in overalls. He saw them not clearing the bar, and he decided he'd do it himself, and he cleared it easily. The next day, he was on the track team, and pretty soon he was the star football player. He went on to become the greatest athlete of that era, and I think that 1912, his final year at Carlisle, was perhaps the greatest single year of athletic achievement of anyone in American history. That was the year that he made the Olympic track team and went to Stockholm, Sweden. And he was not only a participant in the decathlon, but also the pentathlon, which meant 15 events in about 2 weeks. And he won both of them so overwhelmingly that no one has come close, not to the records, but to the distance between Thorpe and the other competitors since then. And in the decathlon, another story that sounds like myth, but is actually true, and there are pictures documenting it, he couldn't find his shoes during a couple of events one morning. The myth is that they were stolen, and in actuality, he probably just couldn't find them. But in any case, he and his coach had to round up some shoes out of wherever they could find them out of the trash. They were different sizes. Thorpe had to wear an extra pair of thick socks on one shoe so that they could fit. And he still won the event and went on to win the decathlon. And at the end of that, the King of Sweden, King Gustav V, in presenting Thorpe the medals and trophies, there was a King of Sweden trophy and a Tsar of Russia trophy that he won for those two events, said, "You, sir, are the most wonderful athlete in the world." And he was. And then he went back to Carlisle that fall and had the greatest football season of anyone to that point, where he led the Carlisle Indians against all of the great schools of that era. In that period of time, the great football powers weren't Alabama and Oklahoma and LSU or Ohio State, but Yale and Princeton and Harvard and Penn and West Point and Syracuse. And Thorpe was the star of that team that defeated almost all of those schools. And there's one game that year, November 9th, 1912, at West Point on the plain, about a mile from General Custer's tomb, that the Indians played the Army. The greatest act of athletic retribution in American history. And the Indians won 27-6. A pure thumping, and Thorpe was the star of that game. On the other team was a linebacker and halfback named Dwight David Eisenhower. And Eisenhower, before the game, had conspired with a teammate that they would knock Thorpe out of the game. Football in that era was, it's always been a violent, vicious sport, as we've seen in the last couple of weeks again with the concussions that suffered by the Miami quarterback. But it was even more violent then. And so Eisenhower and his teammate decided that they would knock Thorpe unconscious by hitting him high and low at the same time. And they actually did, and knocked him to the ground. And he was groggy, but got up about a minute later. And eventually it was Eisenhower who was knocked out of the game and never played again. About 2 months later, in January of 1913, a story was broken in the Worcester Telegram in Massachusetts, where a reporter had interviewed a man who was visiting that town who had been a manager in the Eastern Carolina League in 1909 and 1910, who said that he had been Jim Thorpe's manager. And all of a sudden, that was a scandal because that meant that Jim Thorpe had played professionally before. And it was true. And very quickly, Thorpe lost his medals. And there are 4 reasons why that was completely unjust. The first is that during that period, scores of college athletes were playing college baseball in the summer. But many of them were doing it under aliases. There were so many aliases in the Eastern Carolina League that it was called the Pocahontas League because everyone was named John Smith. Dwight Eisenhower, again, played in the Kansas State League under the name Wilson. Jim Thorpe played under the name Jim Thorpe. He never tried to hide it. His name was in the box scores of the papers in North Carolina, from Charlotte to Raleigh, to all the small towns of that league for 2 summers. No surprise at all. And yet, when the story broke on the East Coast in 1913, all of a sudden, it became a scandal. That's the first aspect of it. The second is that all of the key power figures in Thorpe's life and in amateur sports knew precisely what Jim had been doing and lied about it to save their own reputations. Starting with his coach at Carlisle, Pop Warner. Some of you might know about the youth football Pop Warner leagues. Well, Pop Warner was a brilliant football coach. He was innovative. He tinkered around with things. He was an early proponent of the forward pass, which was only legalized in 1905 when he was at Carlisle. He developed many of the formations that became popularized from then on. He was also a trickster. One year, he sewed a kangaroo pocket in the uniform of one of his players and hid the ball in there, the hidden ball trick. Another time, he put one of his ends near the opposition sideline and had him run around the opposition bench and come out on the other side to catch a pass. I wish that was legal today. But he was always doing interesting things and was a winning football coach. But he was not a winning human being. And he knew exactly what Jim Thorpe had been doing. He had been sending players to play in the minor leagues for years. His best friend, a scout in Pennsylvania, is the one who brought Thorpe and 2 of his buddies down to play for the Rocky Mountain Railroaders. And yet when the story broke in the Worcester paper, Pop Warner denied it, as did the superintendent at Carlisle, Moses Friedman, who actually was writing letters to Thorpe during that entire period saying, I really don't want you to play summer baseball. He knew what he was doing, and then when the story broke, he said, I had no idea. And also James E. Sullivan, who was the most powerful amateur figure in America, the head of the American Olympic Committee, the head of the Amateur Athletic Union, and, not coincidentally, on the board of advisors of the Carlisle Athletic Association. Sullivan too knew what was doing, and yet these are the 3 men that decided that Thorpe had to send his medals back and have the records expunged. Then there's the final question of what is an amateur and what's a professional. Also on that Olympic team that year in 1912 was another future general, George S. Patton. He competed in what was called the modern pentathlon, which involved military-style events, equestrian, fencing, target shooting. He had been being paid by the U.S. Army for a year to practice those events. Was he an amateur or professional? Jim Thorpe had played baseball, which had nothing to do with what he was participating in. The entire Swedish national team was given a leave of absence for 6 months before the Olympics started at full pay. Were they professionals or amateurs? And finally, there's a technical reason, the fourth reason, which is the least important, but maybe the most decisive, which was that the Olympic rules said that any challenge to amateurism had to be filed within 30 days of the end of the Olympics. And this story didn't break, and the challenge wasn't made until 6 months later. So technically, it was wrong. Morally, it was unjust. It was entirely hypocritical. And Thorpe was doing what so many other college students were doing. And yet he was the fall guy for basically a semi-corrupt system. After he lost those medals, Jim Thorpe went on to play Major League Baseball for the New York Baseball Giants. He was not a great baseball player. He was certainly better than Michael Jordan, who tried to do that, in the 1990s. But he never really got a chance to play full-time until 1919 for the Boston Braves. And that year, he led the league in hitting for almost the entire season. So he was mismanaged in baseball. And struggled, being sent down to the minor leagues several times because he wasn't getting a chance to play. He also was a professional football player at a time when professional football was not anything like it is today. It was a ragtag operation and called the Ohio League at first when he played for the Canton Bulldogs. He was the highest paid player in the league, getting about $300 a game. The league was so disorganized that players could actually play 1 week for Akron and the next week for Dayton and the next week for Canton or Youngstown. And, Newt Rockne, the famed future Notre Dame coach, it said played for 6 different teams in 1 year. That was professional football in that era. Thorpe tried to hang on to sports as long as he could. And the afterlife that every athlete has is often the most difficult. These are young people whose greatest achievements are in their 20s and early 30s. Jim Thorpe struggled for a lot of reasons. He struggled because he suffered from alcoholism. He wasn't home much. He had ended up having 3 wives and 7 children. Didn't see much of the children. The first 2 wives divorced him because of his drinking and because he was gone so much. One of his daughters, Grace, was at the Haskell Institute at age 7, and when Jim Thorpe came there to perform at halftime, she didn't even recognize him. So, he had these difficulties in his afterlife. And from then on, he just kept trying. He lived in 20 different states. He worked odd jobs. He, at one point, was digging ditches during the Depression in Los Angeles. He was a greeter at taverns and restaurants. At age 57, he joined the Merchant Marines and sailed during World War II across the Pacific. When they landed in India, the general at the base there didn't want to greet the captain. He wanted to see who the carpenter was, because that was Jim Thorpe. So he still had that name, but not much behind it. He also spent several years in Hollywood, working on the fringes of the movie industry. He was in 70 different movies, but you would barely know it. He was an extra in most of them. Sometimes the billboards would say with Jim Thorpe or starring Jim Thorpe, but you could barely find him in the movie. He was just using his name. But it was an important period for him because he started to feel his self-identity. His athletic career was over. And after that, he started to think more about the injustices that he had faced and that his people had faced. And he became the spokesperson for the 200 or so Native Americans who were on the fringes of Hollywood trying to get jobs as extras. There were so many different Westerns being made during that era. And they were using white actors in grease paint to play Indians. And Thorpe was the spokesperson saying, hire us, hire real Native Americans. And also fighting against the negative stereotypes that were in the movies and that he had faced throughout his career. You know, when he was playing football or baseball, like every other athlete of indigenous heritage, you know, he was always on the warpath, according to the press. They were taking scalps. They were all called chief. All of the stereotypes of Native Americans were things that Jim Thorpe had dealt with throughout his life and really tried to combat when he was in Hollywood. In 1951, he had been trying for 20 years to get a movie made about his life, and it finally happened in 1951. And Jim Thorpe was, you know, he'd been trying to get Native Americans to play Native Americans. Well, Jim Thorpe was played by Burt Lancaster, a great movie star who was sympathetic to the cause of the indigenous peoples, and but was not Native American. The director was Michael Curtiz, a brilliant director who had directed Casablanca. So the movie had a lot going for it. And it was sympathetic to Jim Thorpe, but it was wrong in every respect, small and large. I mean, small things like, you know, the part of Oklahoma when they show that, for some reason, the San Gabriel Mountains of California are in the background because that's where they filmed it. All of the chronology is wrong. But the most important thing that's wrong is that the narrator of the movie and the hero of the movie is not Jim Thorpe, really. It's Pop Warner, his coach. He narrates the story. And the implication is of the white savior. If only Jim Thorpe had followed Pop Warner's direction and more cleanly assimilated into white society, he wouldn't have faced the troubles that he faced, which is, you know, when you look at it from an historical perspective, completely wrong. Jim Thorpe died in 1953 in a trailer park in Lomita, California. He wanted to be buried in Oklahoma. The story of where he ended up getting buried is one of the more bizarre stories in his incredible life. His coffin was, it was his third wife at that point, Patsy Thorpe, who was his equal in many respects. She was older. His first two wives were younger and naive, and Patsy she was a drinker like Jim. She was tough, manipulative, and looking out for his interests and her own at the same time. So when his coffin was sent back to Oklahoma, where he wanted to be buried, Patsy was upset that Oklahoma wasn't giving him the due she thought he deserved, not spending enough money on a mausoleum and honoring him. So in the middle of a ceremony, she went in with a couple of men and took the coffin away. And then essentially tried to find the best bidder for it. Took it to Tulsa for several months, Pittsburgh. Finally, she was in Philadelphia, watching television one night in her hotel room, and saw a story about these two small towns in the Pocono Mountains, coal mining towns, struggling near the Pocono Mountains in Pennsylvania, a Mauch Chunk and East Mauch Chunk, and came up with this idea. And it was sort of like, I compare it to Harold Hill and the Music Man in a sense. And again, I have nothing against these two, you know, this town or the people there. That, you know, they were just trying to survive. But she told them that if they merge and change their name to Jim Thorpe, Pennsylvania, they can have him. And she also promised that there'd be a Jim Thorpe hospital, a Jim Thorpe college. She would build a teepee hotel there. None of which happened, but they did merge. They became Jim Thorpe, Pennsylvania. There's a very nice small mausoleum on the side of the road as you go through town, with his tomb and several statues. But it's in a place where he'd never stepped foot in his entire life. His family was a little bit split over that. The daughters came to accept it. The sons thought he belonged back in Oklahoma, filed suit, won in federal court. It was overturned in the appeals court, and then the Supreme Court wouldn't take it, so that's where he is. Sometime in the early 70s, Muhammad Ali, the great boxer, was training nearby in Deer Park. It said, I want to go pay respects to Jim Thorpe. He drove over to Jim Thorpe, Pennsylvania, got out of his car, looked at the mausoleum on the side of the road, and these two people were standing there in awe that Muhammad Ali was there. What are you doing here? Well, Jim Thorpe's the greatest athlete ever. The greatest. And they said, well, you know, we just changed our name and all we got was one dead Indian, which was a pretty harsh assessment, obviously. But then Muhammad Ali on the way back to Deer Park said, poor Jim Thorpe, even in death, he can't find peace. For some, he has found peace there. For others, they wish he were back in Oklahoma. So there's so many elements of those last 20 to 25 years of Thorpe's life that feel like tragedy. And as I was writing those chapters, I kept sort of thinking, well, something's good got to happen to him. I knew it wasn't, but I just wanted something good to happen to him. And it doesn't. And so I was struggling with that concept. What, you know, is this book a tragedy? And I went back to the reason that I wrote the book, which was to illuminate the Native American experience. In 1915, when Thorpe was still at the prime of his career, playing baseball, starring in football for the Canton Bulldogs, the most popular sculpture in America was called The End of the Trail. It portrayed an Indian slumped on horseback. The horse slumped as well. And the notion was that manifest destiny had prevailed, that progress had rendered indigenous peoples obsolete. It was over. It was a dying race that would soon be dead. There were fewer than 300,000 Native Americans left in America at that point. But it didn't happen. They figured out how to survive through all of the difficulties and obstacles that are thrown in their way. There are now a couple of million Native Americans in this country, still suffering in so many different ways, but also achieving wonderful things, including at the Department of the Interior, where the Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland, is a Pueblo Indian. And I started to think about that and the ways that Jim Thorpe emblemized that whole process. He struggled, but he figured out how to survive. He was persistent, perseverance. He kept trying things, and eventually he developed a legacy of his children. Of those 7 children, 3 of the boys became military officers. All 3 daughters got college degrees. They became activists in the American Indian movement, pushing not only for the restoration of Thorpe's medals, which finally happened only this year, but also for justice for their people. And that continued through the children, the grandchildren, the great-grandchildren. And that's part of Thorpe's legacy, as is the fact that he still represents and means so much to Native Americans everywhere. So in that sense, it's not a tragedy. It's a story of perseverance. Thank you very much. and I'm happy to take questions.
So we have time for about 25 minutes of questions. Again, if you could bring your question to the microphone so everyone could hear it, including our virtual audience, it would be appreciated.
David, the book was our book club book
Oh.
recently, and we really loved it. So
Thank you.
I have two questions.
Sure.
The first is, what is the piece of original reporting in the book that you're most proud of, or was most surprising to you? And the second question is, were there living people who knew Thorpe, who you were able to interview for the book?
Those are both excellent questions. This book is different from any book I've done. This is my 13th book. And, I try to operate under what I call the 4 legs of the table methodology. The first leg is to go there wherever there is. So for my book on Vince Lombardi, I turned to my wife and uttered the immortal loving words, "How would you like to move to Green Bay for the winter?" To which she responded, "Burr." The second leg is to interview as many people as I can. For my biography of Bill Clinton, I interviewed 450 people, a similar number for Lombardi. The third leg is to find all the archival documents I can. And the fourth is to look for what's not there, which is to break through the mythology that's been repeated over and over again. This book challenged me in several ways. One was halfway through the book, COVID came. So I couldn't root myself in Oklahoma, one of the most dangerous places in the country during COVID. I had been there once, but I couldn't go back. I couldn't go to Stockholm, Sweden, where he performed in the Olympics. But for Stockholm, I was able to find a documentarian named Adrian Wood, who'd been commissioned by the International Olympic Committee to take all of the old Pathé newsreels and everything else he could find and develop 2 hours of soundless but incredibly vivid documentary on those Olympics. So, and it eliminated the herky-jerky nature that you often see in old Olympic, or an old film of any, like Babe Ruth running the bases. So I felt like I was there, but I couldn't get there. In terms of interviews, that too was very difficult because there are no contemporaries alive. Jim Thorpe was born in 1887. All 7 of his children are gone. Many of his grandchildren are dead or in their late 70s or 80s. So it was different in that sense. I did interview people, but almost always on the fringes. And I had to rely more than any book I've done on archival research. And there was plenty of that, thank God. I was able, we ask about finds, I was able to find 50 letters that Jim Thorpe had written to his would-be second wife and then second wife while he was at the end of his athletic career. And those letters really evoke almost a Willy Loman style longing of a job that's just about to happen but doesn't quite ever come to fruition. And they allowed me to sort of penetrate the inner Jim Thorpe, which was what I was concerned I wouldn't be able to do in any other way. The internet is a force for horror and wonder. And in this case, all of the government records of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School have been digitized. So that saved me an enormous amount of time, and I was able to pour through that for months. I try to approach every book as though everything surprises me, to start from scratch, that I don't know anything, to get rid of all the presuppositions I might have. And in this case, I knew some about Thorpe the athlete. I knew very little about the surrounding Native American experience. And I'd say that was by far the most meaningful to me, to really see how his life fit into that entire experience.
I just wanted to say that I'm a product of those two towns, Mock Chunk, and I grew up in Jim Thorpe,
All right.
and now I'm living in Maryland.
Okay.
But what you said about, how he was recognized even in Jim Thorpe, there was a time when the old timers in town were upset that they changed the name from Mock
Yes.
Chunk, which is hard to pronounce if you see it written, and it is an Indian name because
Yes.
there were Indians there,
Yes.
and a lot of the surrounding towns are all Indian: Aquashikla, Nesquehoning, Lehighton. So they were. He was in a native. He was in an Indian town, but some of the old timers were upset that they changed it, and they said, like you said, all we got stuck with was an old dead Indian.
Right. It was probably one of those, they were called chunkers, the
Right,
people
chunkers.
who opposed it. Yeah. It's
Yeah,
probably
and
one of
there's
them.
still some of them around, but
Okay.
they're on their
Right.
way out. But at one point as well, they didn't know whether Jim Thorpe was really in there.
Well, that's a bogus thing. I mean, he was in there, but
Well,
they tried to.
I think they even dug him up.
They did. Well, they didn't dig him up. They tried to.
Yes.
Yeah,
to
the chunkers
verify
did.
that he was
Yes.
there.
Right.
But I was in second grade when the
Oh.
name was changed from
Uh-huh.
Mock Chunk to Jim Thorpe.
Uh-huh.
And I still remember, I'm not sure if you call it a caisson or what, to take the body through town.
Yes.
And it passed right in front of our house.
Yeah, and they let all the school children out that day too.
Right. It was a big
Yeah.
deal.
Yeah.
And the reason why Grace Thorpe had found out about it, you said she saw the article on television about these two towns.
Patsy Thorpe.
Oh, Patsy,
Yeah.
Patsy Thorpe, about these two towns. We had a lot of industry in our town in the late 1800s,
Yeah.
and it all fell apart
Right.
with the World Wars, and the town was really struggling.
Mhm.
And they had this campaign called Nickel a Week Fund, and people were supposed to donate as many nickels as they could to build up a resource to be able to bring industry back into town again. And Patsy
Saw
Thorpe
that.
saw that,
Yes.
came to Jim Thorpe and talked to the editor of our newspaper,
Right.
and that was Jim Boyle.
Yes.
Yes, Joe Boyle.
Joe
It
Boyle.
was Joe Boyle, and I think you have it in the book too.
Yep.
Well, this is fascinating to me because
Well, it's fascinating to me that somebody from Jim Thorpe is here. Thank you.
but I'm like 2/3 through it, and my brother has a book and my sister
Oh.
has a book, and I got mine from my sister.
Uh-huh.
You know what? If you went to Jim Thorpe and spoke at their library, you might get a whole lot more books sold.
Well, I'm going to Carlisle tomorrow,
Oh, okay.
and Jim Thorpe. Some people there want me to come. We're trying to work it
Oh,
out.
you've got to come.
Yeah, I'm sure I will.
You have to come.
Yeah.
In fact, when Jim Thorpe was Mock Chunk
Yeah.
back in the late 1800s, it was very wealthy through the coal mines and the railroad that was built. There were 13 millionaires that lived in Jim Thorpe
That's right.
that
Yeah.
barely had 1,000 people in it. 13 millionaires. So it's quite a town, even from both ends,
Yes.
because they had so much. They built the very first railroad in the whole United States. It was called the Switchback Mountain. It hoisted coal up the one side of the mountain and let it go by gravity down the other side to all the different towns.
Wow.
Collected the coal and then came back the same way. So Jim Thorpe and Mock Chunk both have a really amazing history. Let me know when you're going.
I will, ma'am. What's your name?
Eileen.
Eileen. Thank you very much. That was a good history lesson. And I appreciate you being here.
Hey, Dave. I haven't read the book yet, but you do good work, and I will.
Oh, thank
But,
you.
I think I have 3 questions here. One, how do you think Jim Thorpe would have turned out if his medals weren't taken away from him? And secondly,
Say that again. I'm
how do you
sorry.
think Thorpe would have turned out if his
Oh,
medals weren't taken
okay.
away from him? And secondly, do you think they would have found some other way to diminish him, if not for that reason that he was ostensibly a professional baseball player? And thirdly, if he'd been white and all the facts were the same, would the same thing have happened?
Well, all of those questions go into one question, really. I don't think that him being Native American was the only reason, but I think it made it easier for him to be sort of the fall guy for what was basically a corrupt system. They had to protect that, and he was an easy one to let go in that sense. I think that he would have had some of the struggles anyway. But, his life was defined by loss in so many ways. First the loss of his twin at age 9. Imagine how you would feel if you lost a twin. Oh, you're everything, Eileen. Yeah. Come on up here. Later, after he lost his medals, he lost his 3-year-old son, namesake, Jim Thorpe Jr., to the 1918 influenza. So there were a lot, he suffered in a lot, and those are just the personal ways, not even the social, sociological ways that he suffered because of where he came from and who he was. So I think life is never that black and white. You can't say that this is the only reason something happened, but all of that were definitely factors. The fact that he wasn't white, a lot of white athletes were doing the same thing. I didn't even mention that so many Carlisle and most of those schools in colleges were paying players during that era. They were all professionals in that sense, as they are in so many places today. So I think he did suffer more because of who he was, I guess is the bottom line to that, but I don't think it's the only reason that he suffered. Thanks. Hey.
Two unrelated questions, so take
Okay.
them separately completely or just pick one.
Why don't you ask them one at a time so I'll remember them?
Sure. Have you and Jane Levy had an opportunity to spend some time talking about the two characters that you've both written about? And I don't mean Mickey Mantle.
Yeah, and actually your name is pronounced Levy. Most people don't know that. I've mispronounced it myself. We're good friends. So yes, we've talked about all of our books together. She worked at the Washington Post for a while, where I've been for 45 years. Which book were you referring to?
I was thinking of Babe Ruth. I mean, Babe Ruth.
The Baltimore guy.
Right.
Yeah.
And, but also, just in terms of.
There's some parallels.
Magnificent athlete.
Yes. And interestingly, when the Associated Press had all the sports writers vote for the greatest athlete of the first half of the 20th century, it wasn't Babe Ruth. It was Jim Thorpe. And Thorpe and Babe knew each other. There was a time, this is when Thorpe was 45 years old, he was still playing baseball for a team called Harjo's Indians. It was an all-native team, and they travel around the country, sort of like, the novel Bingo Long and the Traveling All-Stars, or the House of David team from Michigan, or all of the Negro League teams. As a matter of fact, they played a lot of the Negro League teams, including the Pittsburgh Crawfords, who had Josh Gibson, Satchel Paige, Cool Papa Bell, all on that one team. Thorpe played against them. They get to New York, and Thorpe goes into the dugout with Babe Ruth, and they talk, and there's a little scene in the book about them exchanging their stories. So I think of them in some ways as kind of alike. They, both sort of, in a sense, overwhelmed by fame and not, Babe was a little more outgoing in some ways, but also wasn't really, that wasn't what he was about. And I think he and Thorpe had a sort of a common bond in some ways. And Jane and I talked about that. And your second question?
The second question, with regard to the Native American schools, are you familiar with the novelist William Kent Kruger? He's written a great, the Native American experience is a part of many of his novels.
Yeah, I am familiar with it. I haven't, I've read one of his books, and it wasn't quite that as much as some of his other novels. But one of the one of the resources I used for the man who asked me about finding things, when I went to the Beinecke Rare Book Library and Archive at Yale, they had not only the papers of the founder of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, Richard Henry Pratt, but also of the great Native American novelist N. Scott Momaday. And he was obsessed with the Indian schools and tried to write, well, he did write a screenplay about Carlisle. And I found all of his papers and his study of Carlisle really helpful and fascinating. Sure. Hi.
Good, how are you?
Good,
It
thanks.
was so interesting, and I didn't know anything about Jim Thorpe
Good.
until this morning, so thank you. That was
Sure.
so interesting. But during the speech, you mentioned that when he was in Hollywood, he had to kind of fight for getting Native Americans represented in film. And that's a very current topic right now,
Yes.
casting and all of that. And I ask you, did you have any pushback being this white man
Thank you for
voice
asking.
for
Right.
that story?
So a couple of things. Of course, I thought about that before I even started. And the first thing I did was contact 5 key Native American scholars and activists and said, am I the right person to do this? One was Patty Lowe, who was the head of the Indigenous Research at Northwestern. And she said, yes, emphatically, yes, do it. Then I went to Yale and talked to Ned Blackhawk, who's a professor up there. And we had a long talk, and he also encouraged me to do it. The first person who ever mentioned Jim Thorpe to me was an Oneida from Wisconsin who came up to me 20 years ago when I was at the Denver Press Club talking about another book. Norbert Hill is his name, and he had a sheaf of papers with him. And he said, David, here's your next book. And it was all Jim Thorpe. And I sort of politely said, you know, I don't take suggestions from other people, and I'm going to work on Clemente now, but thank you very much. But he planted that seed, and it grew. And then finally, when I first started the book, the first person I talked to at length was Suzanne Sean Harjo, who was a leading Indian activist who fought to change the name of the Washington football team for decades and was given a Presidential Medal of Freedom by Barack Obama. And we've spent a lot of time talking. So I inculcated myself in that world, which is, you know, I mean, everybody has strengths and weaknesses. One of my strengths is an ability to see the world from different perspectives and not impose my own on it. And so all of those people were very encouraging. And if there's a movie made about this book, it will be directed by a Native American. But it is an important question. So.
I was wondering, you mentioned that you've done a trilogy of sports biographies.
Yes.
I was wondering, was that by design? Did you set up to do that, or did that just happen? And what are do you find any links between the history of Clemente and the history of Thorpe?
You know, this is sort of the second trilogy I've written, and in both cases, I didn't realize it was a trilogy until I started the third book. I did a trilogy on the 1960s, starting with Rome 1960, then they marched into sunlight about the Vietnam War, and Detroit is sort of the urban part of that story. And in this case, again, when I started Thorpe, I thought, oh, this fits it all together. I'd actually earlier wanted to do a biography of Billie Jean King, and she had approached me about it. But in the end, I don't blame her, but she wanted control of the story, and I don't do that kind of as told to book, so I couldn't do it. But I'm sure there are parallels. All three of Clemente, Lombardi, and Thorpe all faced enormous obstacles. I mean, Clemente, think about it. He was a Black Puerto Rican speaking a different language, dealing with sort of the double discrimination of language and race in, you know, almost as a migrant worker in America, and won completely this country over, especially the people of Pittsburgh. Vince Lombardi always thought that he was discriminated against because he was a dark-skinned Italian American. He didn't get his shot until he was 45 years old. He'd labored in the vineyards for 20 years before he was got his first head coaching job at Green Bay. And Thorpe had all those obstacles to face as well. So I think incredible talent and will is what binds them together.
David, we have time for one more question. It's going to come from our audience online.
Great.
Are there any other figures, especially in sports, that you've considered researching, investigating?
Well, as I just said, Billie Jean King was one. I think I don't have another sports figure right now in mind. And I've never viewed those books. I mean, I love sports, but I'm not going to just write another book about a football coach or a baseball player, because that's not why I write the books. I want to be able to illuminate history and sociology. So I think I would like to write a biography of a woman, and I don't quite have the right one yet in my mind. But that's sort of the next exploration for me. I started to research a biography of Paul Robeson, who was an athlete as well as everything else. But after reading Martin Duberman's biography, it's so good. It's the first time I've read another book and said, nah, it's not. There's not that much I can add. It's really, it's the only time in my career that that's happened to me. So thank you very much.
So David will be outside in a couple minutes to sign your books. Also, Charm City Books here is selling books. Please buy a book, get it signed. You can't get your library book signed. We won't take it back. I'm sorry. It works every time.